Welcome to the next in the series of departmental research seminars for the Department of Psychology at Durham University, I should say in the UK, because I know that we've got a very varied, wide international audience today. So thank you to everybody for joining us. We're really pleased that today's departmental seminar is hosted by myself and Mary from the Centre for Developmental Disorders in Durham. And we're really thrilled to have Dr. Noah Sasson giving today's talk. An internationally renowned researcher in the autism field. Noah is an associate professor in the School of Behaviour and Brain Sciences at the University of Texas and is director of the Social Cognition and Interaction in Autism Lab. He has published a huge volume of research on autism, and we're going to hear about some of his recent work today. We're really thrilled that Noah can join us. The number of people, we had 262 people registered to attend today's talk. I think that shows how a popular presenter we have and fantastic research being presented today, literally an audience from all over the world. So we're really thrilled to be able to hear Noah speak. There are many, many downsides of a global pandemic, but I guess one of the positives is moving certain activities online, meaning that we can reach a much wider audience with those activities. And it would have been difficult for us to get Noah over to Durham to be able to give one of our departmental seminars. So we wanted to really take this opportunity to have Noah speak for us today on an online platform. So huge thank you to Noah for agreeing to give this talk, especially as it's 7 a.m. your time. So thank you for that commitment as well. So I'm going to hand over to Noah now. I should also say, though, that we've disabled the chat, but if you have questions that you wish to post as you go along, please use the Q&A, question and answer tab at the bottom. What we'll do is at the end of Noah's presentation, we'll take a few of the questions that have been put in that Q&A tab and pose those to Noah as part of question and answer session after his presentation. So please do feel free to use that Q&A tab, and Mary and I will keep a lookout for questions in there to be able to present them to Noah after his presentation. So I'd hand over to Noah. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we're really looking forward to this talk on interpersonal mechanisms of social disability among autistic adults. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Thank you guys for inviting me to be here. So I've been involved with autism research for almost 20 years now, first as a student, then as a professor, and a lot has changed in the field and in my thinking and the type of studies I do. And so the way I prepared this talk is to hopefully communicate about how and why that's occurred, and with a particular emphasis on the type of studies we've been doing in the past several years in my lab, examining social interaction among and between autistic and non-autistic people. So first, let me start with just a little bit of background. Obviously, most people in this audience is likely familiar with autism, but for those who may not, let me start with just a little bit of information about autism and some of the historical priorities within autism research. As most of you know, autism is a developmental disability that affects how one experiences the world. It's a different way of being. When diagnosed clinically, it's done so through observation based on several social and non-social behavioral indicators, such as experiencing social difficulties, having communication differences, sensory sensitivities, passion and interests, often called restricted interest in the clinical literature, a preference for routine, which is sometimes called an insistence on sameness, among many other features. Autism, of course, is now recognized as a spectrum, but I think that leads a lot of people to mistakenly think of it as some linear hierarchy of symptoms and abilities that can be ranked from high to low, but it's really more like a broad and highly variable constellation of abilities, challenges, strengths, with autistic people having a wide range of different support needs. But because autism is a developmental condition that's often, but not always, identifiable early in childhood, its first clinical descriptions dating way back to the 1940s were of children, and to this day, autism research still largely focuses on kids. There was a recent analysis that indicated that only about 20% of all published autism research studies recently even mention adults. And that's, of course, despite the majority of autistic people themselves being adults. That low number is actually a marked improvement from just a decade ago when the proportion was more like 10%. Well, there's a lot of reasons for this, but one is that research funding, particularly here in the United States, tilts heavily towards understanding the neurobiology and genetics of autism, or identifying early markers that are presumed to aid early intervention. In my view, there's a lot of important applications for this kind of work, like better understanding the neurological differences that accompany sensory sensitivities in autism, or the elevated rates of epilepsy or sleep problems or self-injury or anxiety. There's lots of applications for this, but at the same time, often this funding has come at the expense of other types of research, including behaviorally and more socially focused work, or lifespan studies, or service-oriented research. And one important point here is that current funding priorities are often at odds with the priorities outlined by stakeholders, especially the autism community itself, who on average, although there's lots of debate and disagreement about these things, tend to emphasize services in translational research that can help in the here and now over more basic biological research. One reason I think we need more social research focused on autistic adults is that, unfortunately, many autistic adults have poor life outcomes. Many have unmet social needs, and many report experiencing high rates of loneliness, which of course is contrary to some theories of reduced social motivation in autism. Autistic adults often face occupational challenges, such as struggling to live independently and being able to secure and sustain regular employment that matches their actual capability levels. They're often underemployed or poorly compensated. And not incidental to those outcomes, autistic adults experience high rates of mental health difficulties, including anxiety, depression, and increased rates of suicidality. And on average, autistic adults experience a lower quality of life, even subjectively reported quality of life. And among some subgroups of autistic adults, even a much lower quantity of life as well. These outcomes tend to occur for autistic adults, regardless of their measured level of intelligence. So many of the underlying mechanisms at work here seem to be unrelated to intellectual functioning. So this background brings me to the broad questions that my research tries to address, which is broadly focused on identifying what mechanisms are driving poor social outcomes for autistic adults. Part of my intellectual journey as a researcher has been to question some of the assumptions about these mechanisms, about how we measure them, how we interpret them, because those assumptions we make about what to study and how to report what we find has important implications for how we think about and communicate about autism. Ultimately, the hope of the work is that by better understanding what leads to poor outcomes, we'll have some insight about what needs to change to improve them. So one way to think about these mechanisms is to think about them as intrinsic or extrinsic to the autistic person. That's pretty simplistic and perhaps a false dichotomy in some ways, but it's a helpful heuristic for me because overwhelmingly autism research has historically focused on intrinsic mechanisms. What I mean by intrinsics are all the neurobiological, cognitive, and behavioral differences that characterize autism. The vast majority of autism studies focus on intrinsic mechanisms. And this has happened in part, especially here in the United States, I think, because of autism research emerging from psychiatry that applies a medical or even deficit model to autism. This model, in brief, is that the goal of medicine is to identify what's quote unquote wrong with the person and then prescribe a way to fix it. And from that perspective, the emphasis is on characterizing deficits that are presumed to need remediation. Now, not all intrinsic mechanisms necessarily align with a medical model. I mean, for instance, there is a cognitive theory that's increasingly gaining some interest, suggesting that autism is characterized by monotropism, which is an attentional style of hyperfocus that may offer some explanatory power for quote unquote restrictive interests in other aspects of autism. And this does not come from a deficit framing. But from a deficit framework, it naturally follows that any treatment should focus on trying to normalize or fix the deficit of the autistic individual with the assumption that that's going to improve their ultimate outcomes. This assumption, in my view, has not been well supported by the evidence, but I'm going to get to a little bit of that later. In contrast, extrinsic mechanisms refer to factors outside of the autistic person, such as systematic barriers, social exclusion, non-autistic people's biases. From that perspective, outcomes can be improved through support, accommodation, and acceptance. Acceptance being a key concept here. Inclusion is more than just integration, but it's the autistic person feeling like they belong, that they're accepted, that they're valued, and that they're able to behave authentically. The treatment focus of extrinsic mechanisms would be more on restructuring the social environment to alleviate some of these extrinsic barriers. Now, in actuality, it isn't necessarily an either or proposition. These mechanisms intersect and interact with each other. Disability emerges as a fit between the person's characteristics and environmental demands. So one way to think about this is that a non-autistic person trying to get along in a predominantly autistic world would likely be quite disabled. So disability is not just of the person, but of the person within a specific environment. In my view, autism research is often pretty reductive, and the almost exclusive focus on intrinsic mechanisms overlooks that they exist within an extrinsic context. In other words, that researchers in the audience might understand, we're often mistakenly looking for main effects within a complex web of interactions. So what historically are the intrinsic mechanisms that have most commonly been studied in autism research to try to explain autistic social disability? Well, first is, as I mentioned before, social motivation, which is defined as the seeking and liking of social information and relationships, and interest in forming relationships. Social motivation is actually quite variable among autistic people, in contrast to the stereotype that they lack motivation to be around others or form relationships. Most autistic adolescents and adults, for instance, express the same level of interest in forming friendships and pursuing relationships as their non-autistic peers. There may be differences in how they prefer to pursue those relationships, but that desire is there. I should also note that reduced or different social motivation should not be viewed as inherently negative, which a deficit framing would tend to propagate. If it differs from the norm from that kind of perspective, then it must be in need of fixing. But some people may be just fine the way they are. It's when their social needs are not being met that we need to be concerned. Another intrinsic mechanism that has been highly studied in autism research is social behavior or social skill, which is often defined as the repertoire of behaviors used to navigate social demands across varying contexts. Social behaviors do differ on average between autistic and non-autistic adults. They may differ in how they use gaze, how they express themselves non-verbally in their face and their voice through gestures. They may differ in their conversational preference or their desire or lack thereof for things like chit chat, right? But again, unless these are overly disabling or causing distress, that such behavioral differences may not be in need of fixing. Behavior for all human beings has some underlying adaptive function. Those who, for instance, may be uncomfortable with eye gaze may be that way because it's adaptive for them. They may be neurologically different, and gaze may be overstimulating or distracting or not as socially engaging or rewarding as it is for some non-autistic people. The solution, from my perspective, is not to force the autistic person to appear more normative, but to understand the reason for the behavior and adjust to it. That leads to a broader point about what's deemed to be good social skill is often gauged relative to some normative assumptions and standards, which denies the adaptive function of those behaviors for autistic people. It also fails to acknowledge that social interaction quality is determined relationally and not just individually. It takes two to tango, as they say, but more on that in a minute. And finally, one of the most heavily researched intrinsic mechanisms, and indeed the focus of much of my earlier work and some of my current work too, is social cognition, which refers to perceiving and accurately interpreting the thoughts, feelings, and intentions of other people. Going back nearly 40 years now, social cognition has been the focus of countless autism studies, both at the neural and behavioral level. In young children, for instance, some social cognitive differences that have been extensively studied are things like reduced or different attention to social stimuli, or reduced joint attention with another person, or less spontaneous sharing of interest with another person. In later childhood and adulthood, there have been literally hundreds and likely thousands of studies showing that autistic people at the group level, and I say group level because there tends to be a lot of individual variability here, perform less well on standardized measures of face recognition, emotion recognition, and theory of mind, which is the concept of trying to accurately infer what another person may be thinking. These tasks tend to be experimental tasks, often conducted in laboratories, on computer screens, or in paper and pencil assessments, and they don't often mimic how social cognition occurs in the real world. For instance, there have been recent analyses showing that things like theory of mind are very difficult to measure objectively. There are many measures of theory of mind, and disappointingly enough, they often don't correlate with one another, suggesting that they aren't measuring the same thing. And many of these tasks also have high verbal components and other demands unrelated to social cognition that affect performance. And of course, as I will get to later, there are a bunch of recent studies indicating that non-autistic people often demonstrate theory of mind deficits when trying to understand what autistic people are thinking. So this doesn't seem to be an inherent characteristic unique to people with different clinical conditions, including autism. So I thought I'd show you some quick examples from my early work demonstrating what some of these social cognitive studies tend to be like. Here, for instance, was the first study I ever contributed to. It was the first eye tracking study of autism when eye tracking was really hard to do. We actually only had 5 participants in each group here, which is a bit ridiculous in retrospect. But we found that the autistic people in our sample looked at these static black and white images of emotional expressions differently than non-autistic controls. Subsequent studies have suggested that face scanning is much more variable among autistic people than we found here, but nevertheless, this is my most highly cited paper and is in some intro to psychology textbooks and other things because of such a salient finding here that was of interest to many people. The second study examined how people attended to faces in these dramatic old movie scenes when trying to decode what the protagonist might be feeling. Sometimes we digitally erased the face and sometimes it was included. And we found that autistic adults and individuals with schizophrenia didn't increase their gaze to the face of the character when it was included nearly as much as controls did, suggesting that they were relying on other kind of cues to decode the emotional experience of the protagonist. Interestingly enough, and downplayed in this study, the 3 groups actually didn't differ in their accuracy of recognizing emotion in the characters. So I guess we could have concluded that autistic adults are actually more efficient at extracting emotional information from faces since they didn't have to look at them as long. But of course, that's not how we interpreted it at the time. But these images, these static images, especially of facial expressions that are used time and time again in autism research and other research, often ignore broader context for their interpretations. Emotional expressions don't happen in isolation, they happen in broader contexts, and these contexts are really important for determining what somebody might be feeling. Here, for instance, you see some facial expressions that might be misinterpreted when viewed by themselves. Once you have the broader context, though, you have more clues to infer how they're really feeling, and that facial expression might not always map on in predictable ways to what the person is feeling given the contextual cues. So this woman in the bottom left, for instance, is actually at a Justin Bieber concert. So in a subsequent study, we tried to see how much people rely on the face when judging emotion in congruent and incongruent emotional context. This is still incredibly artificial, of course, and doesn't reflect the real world. And my Photoshop skills, especially at the time, were pretty bad, but it was an attempt to see what is perceived as more salient among different groups of people. So here you see a face judged to be mildly fearful. placed in scenes that are reliably judged to have different emotional resonances. For instance, at the very top, you can see a congruent emotional scene where a gun is being pointed at. All the others, though, are incongruent. We found that both the autism and schizophrenia groups fixated on faces less in the scenes than in controls. But only the autism group didn't increase their gaze to the face when it was placed in an incongruent condition. So that suggests that they were relying less on the face for emotion recognition when context cues were ambiguous or conflicting. Again, it's important to state that there's not a right way to examine social scenes, and that this should be viewed as a difference, not a deficit. Emotion recognition accuracy was actually not that different between the groups. But it's also hard to judge objectively what emotion choice is right when the emotion in the face is different from the emotion in the scene. Here's one last example from some of my earlier work. That was actually done with preschool age kids. It's a passive viewing task designed to determine how much social attention might be modulated by competing non-social stimuli. Here we used objects that are commonly selected as very strong interests for the young autistic children, often called circumscribed interests, as they were in this study at the time. Things like vehicles and trains and electronics, and some objects that are everyday objects that are very rarely selected as these strong interests, like household plants. Here's a quick video, hope this works, of a 4-year-old autistic boy as he viewed these pictures however he liked. There's no task demands. And what you can see is that in many contexts, he does look at the face pretty normatively, even looking at the eyes of the face. Here's that everyday object of a household plant, and he's going back and forth, but he started with the person. Here, however, when there are more of these interesting objects that many young children prefer over household plants, he prioritizes it and spends less time looking at the face. So what we were really seeing is that theories about reduced social attention among autistic kids was maybe too general a conclusion, and the extent of social attention really depends upon context and competing stimuli in the environment. Here's a very busy graph from the paper, but what all three of these figures are showing is that the autistic kids really didn't differ from non-autistic kids in their social attention when the boring objects competed for their attention. Let me just focus on the top graph. All of them are relatively similar patterns. The top graph is just the percentage of time that they looked at the face on the screen. And that what you can see is that both groups of kids lessened their attention to faces when the interesting objects, remember they were called circumscribed objects at the time, CI, were on the screen. We just found that the autistic children did so to a greater degree. It had a larger effect. So what we were concluding here is that social attention and autism may be a matter of relative salience, and not always in all contexts is it going to appear notably different from non-autistic controls. Now, a big criticism of this in many related studies is that the sample and samples in many autism studies was overwhelmingly male. In subsequent collaborations with a colleague at North Carolina, Claire Harrop, we showed that these patterns didn't extend in the same way to autistic females. For one, findings like that are inconsistent with an extreme male brain theory of autism, because from that perspective, autistic females should resemble autistic males. But also, this kind of criticism reflects a larger problem in a lot of autism research, that the samples are often heavily biased to middle and upper class white male samples. And we need to be cautious about generalizing too much to other groups of autistic people. And I'm happy that this series of collaborative efforts with Claire helped demonstrate that some of our earlier findings should not be generalized too much to all autistic people. So these are just some examples of how social cognition is often studied in autism research. But remember, the reason it's so heavily studied is because it's assumed to be a primary mechanism underlying social disability in autism. I began to question that assumption more and more over the years. But in truth, this assumption had been challenged by autistic people themselves for a long time, whose writing I started to discover in more detail about 10 years ago, but hadn't before because I was happily working in my hermetically sealed autism research bubble. But there's also a growing empirical literature showing that the effects of psychosocial treatment, like social skills training programs and treatments designed to improve social cognition among autistic kids and adults, are actually produce little to no benefit on real world outcomes. They do in some cases increase their social knowledge or improve their performance on assessments of social cognition, but they often don't really lead to better personal and professional outcomes. So in recent years, I really tried to put the assumption to the test of social cognition predicting social disability. We've now shown in large samples that autistic adults without intellectual disability do underperform relative to non-autistic controls on some social cognitive tests. This is on average, and the effects aren't always very large, but we do find them. And that may be because there are differences in how autistic adults evaluate social information, or maybe these tasks are measuring normative social cognitive assumptions, or maybe performance among autistic people is influenced by things like stereotype threat or other factors, but the differences are reliably found. But regardless, for them to have clinical meaning, they should predict what they're presumed to predict. And we largely don't find that. After taking into account general cognition, social cognitive performance only accounts for a small percentage of the variance in observed quote unquote social skill, and it doesn't predict the functional abilities among autistic adults. Neurocognition, executive function, general IQ are actually much more predictive. Social cognitive performance also doesn't predict social interaction quality for autistic adults, nor does it predict how they are perceived by non-autistic people. What seems much more predictive are factors like relational compatibility between interaction partners. Catherine Crompton is doing wonderful work in this area, for instance. She's found that autistic adults often report greater interpersonal rapport with other autistic adults relative to non-autistic adults. But I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. This leads me into discussing extrinsic mechanisms. So what else is contributing to poor social outcomes and experiences for autistic adults? Well, social interaction by definition involves more than one people. That seems obvious to say, but autism research studies have largely failed to measure actual social interaction. When interaction quality is poor, it's poor for both people. So it seems like if you want to know what's contributing to poor interaction, we should study interaction, or at least the contributions of both people in the exchange. But that's not historically what's happened. Research has focused almost exclusively on the characteristics of the autistic person. What about the other person? What about the relational dynamic between the two? More recent studies are confirming what many autistic people have been saying for a while, that it's not just that they have trouble understanding non-autistic people, but non-autistic people have trouble understanding them or inferring their thoughts and feelings. But rarely, if ever, do we see this referred to as a non-autistic deficit in autistic theory of mind, for instance. So this acknowledgement that communication is bidirectional speaks to a guiding theoretical framework for better understanding social interaction difficulties in autism. It's called the double empathy problem proposed by Damian Milton. It's called double empathy because both parties, not just the autistic person, may struggle to understand each other's thoughts and feelings and behaviors and differences. The autistic person, for example, may struggle to read between the lines of something the non-autistic person says, or overcome misconceptions about autism from their partner, or manage their sensory distractions. And the non-autistic person may misread what the autistic person is feeling, or not understand those sensory difficulties, or have different expectations about what makes for a good interaction. Thankfully, we're starting to see a lot of momentum towards studying communication and connection in autism as a two-way street, and conceptualizing social interaction impairments between autistic and non-autistic people as relational rather than an individual impairment on the part of the autistic person. Our lab began studying these questions about 5 or 6 years ago with a really basic question. How do the perceptions of potential social partners affect autistic social experiences? And we did this by studying a concept known as first impressions. First impressions of unfamiliar people are formed within seconds, and they influence our social decisions and behavior, like whether we decide to approach somebody or whether we withdraw from the environment in which we find them. Our first study was a collaboration with Dan Kennedy at Indiana University and Ruth Grossman at Emerson College, and it was pretty simple. How do non-autistic adults form first impressions of autistic adults from just about 10 seconds of video recorded while that person was talking? we found that they rated autistic adults as more awkward, as less attractive, as less likable, but interestingly, not less intelligent or less trustworthy than non-autistic controls who were similar to the autistic sample in age, race, gender, and IQ. But perhaps more importantly, we found that non-autistic adults reported less interest in future social interaction with them in a number of different ways, including not wanting to hang out with them. So what were these non-autistic adults using to make these decisions? Well, we've shown in other studies that autistic adults do often present different socially, and non-autistic adults evaluate their emotional expressions in their face or even in their voice as awkward or less natural, and these may drive these negative first impressions. In this particular study, it was very clear that it was the visual and auditory cues, not the content of what the autistic adults were saying, that drove these negative impressions. In other words, it was the style, not the substance, that was underlying the formation of negative first impressions. Let me show you how we know this. Autistic adults who were rated less favorably than non-autistic controls happened when the whole video was being shown, when it was just the audio of the voice that we isolated and had them evaluate, when it was the video with no audio, and even when it was just a static image of the autistic person. However, ratings didn't differ when their impressions were based on a transcript of what the people were actually saying. So obviously, there are potentially big implications for findings like this. Negative first impressions can contribute to the social exclusion of autistic people. They can reduce social opportunities, and when they do occur, the non-autistic person may be bringing in biases that affect the quality of the interaction. These processes over time can be quite socially harmful. They construct interpersonal and even systemic obstacles for autistic people in their efforts to pursue their professional and personal goals. Social exclusion ultimately may contribute to mental health difficulties for many autistic people, including anxiety, depression, and even, as I mentioned before, increased rates of suicidality. We then asked whether impressions of autistic adults differ when non-autistic people know that the person they're evaluating is autistic. We thought this might be evidence that this kind of evidence might help determine what effects autistic people might expect if they decide to disclose their diagnosis to unfamiliar people. Now, as many of you are aware, some autistic adults mask their autistic behaviors to avoid discrimination, as they've learned through experience that their autistic differences can be judged negatively. Now, not all autistic adults do this, and many can't do this, but for those who do, they tend to do so in response to the stigma attached to certain autistic characteristics. This is not specific to autism. It's an adaptive response that many stigmatized groups do to protect themselves. Ironically, like such camouflaging behaviors, as it's sometimes called, requires pretty savvy social cognition. You have to understand how your behaviors are being viewed by others and then adjust them to, in some ways, manipulate other people's perceptions to be more favorable to you. That's a kind of impression management that almost everyone does to some degree. Alternatively, there's some discussion that camouflaging is not done via social cognition, but done through more general cognition as what's been called compensation. Camouflaging is getting a lot of research attention lately, and I expect we'll continue to see research about how and why it occurs and the mechanisms by which it occurs. But masking takes a lot of effort, and it's linked to higher stress and anxiety among autistic people. So understanding the effects of diagnostic disclosure struck us as an important area to explore. What we tended to find generally is that informing non-autistic raters that a person is autistic reduces but doesn't eliminate their negative first impressions. Here you can see some of our findings. Non-autistic people, shown over here, are rated more favorably across the first impression items than autistic people. But within the autistic people, you see this small but significant bump in how they're evaluated when the rater is told that they're autistic. We think what's happening is that knowing the diagnosis provides the rater with an explanation for social presentations they perceive as different. But interestingly, we found that even mislabeling non-autistic people as autistic improved their first impressions. In contrast, though, we found that mislabeling people as having schizophrenia actually worsened their impressions. And This is the opposite of the effect that the autism label produced, suggesting that there is a very large stigma attached to schizophrenia that can drive negative perception of first impressions. But this story isn't so simple. In a later study, we found that if the non-autistic person actually comes into the study holding highly stigmatized views about autism, telling them the person that they're rating as autistic actually worsens their impressions. So disclosure is really complicated. And in the real world, autistic people reported that it's often met with negative consequences, especially in employment environments. So more broadly, I think this focus on to disclose or not disclose unfairly places the burden on autistic people to improve how they're perceived and treated, which doesn't seem like the most equitable solution. So we're also interested in seeing if we can find other avenues to greater acceptance of autism among non-autistic people. Our next step was then to figure out what predicts whether non-autistic people view autistic people more or less favorably. We see in our data that first impressions of autistic people are often better predicted by characteristics of the non-autistic rater than of the characteristics of the autistic person being rated. What this means is that there's a lot of variability in how non-autistic people view autistic people. We find, for instance, that non-autistic people with lower stigma towards autism and higher factual knowledge about autism tend to form more positive impressions of autistic people. Well, you might be thinking, well, who has more familiarity with autism than autistic people themselves? How do they form impressions of autistic people? Well, in a study led by one of my doctoral students, Kylie Deberbander, we found that autistic raters also rate unfamiliar autistic people less favorably than unfamiliar non-autistic people. However, and this is pretty big, this didn't translate to lower social interest for them like it does for non-autistic adults. The autistic raters expressed just as much social interest in the autistic adults they rated less favorably as the non-autistic adults they rated more favorably. And interestingly enough, providing them with the diagnostic label didn't affect their ratings at all, in contrast to non-autistic raters. Perhaps they could already tell the person is autistic without it, or perhaps the diagnosis is just irrelevant for how they evaluate people. In any case, these findings led us to ask whether improving autism knowledge and reducing autism stigma might increase autism acceptance and inclusion among non-autistic people. There's been some promising work in this area, particularly among college students, but usually these studies are of vignettes or testing whether you can actually increase a person's autism knowledge. But it turns out non-autistic people are actually really bad at knowing whether they know a lot about autism. People who say they do often score poorly on actual assessments of their autism knowledge. So actually asking people how much they know about autism is not always the most accurate way of measuring their knowledge. Our first attempt to test whether we could influence impressions of autistic people based on increasing familiarity and knowledge was a study led by my other doctoral student, Desi Jones, that examined the effects of an autism acceptance training module. This module is a narrated video made with autistic input that features firsthand accounts from autistic adults and covers the challenges many autistic people face, their strengths, autism stereotypes and misconceptions, and introduces the concept of neurodiversity. We had 238 non-autistic adults watch this, or watch a mental health training that didn't mention autism at all, or they didn't go through any training. And then they completed a battery of measures assessing both explicit and implicit biases about autism. Explicit measures included giving their first impressions of real actual autistic people, testing their autism knowledge and stigma, and their beliefs about the functional capabilities of autistic people. The implicit measure was an implicit association task that measures whether the participant automatically and implicitly associates autism-related terms with unpleasant attributes. So here's what we found. Non-autistic adults completing the autism acceptance training demonstrated fewer misconceptions about autism, expressed less stigma about autism, reported higher expectations of autistic abilities, had more positive first impressions of autistic people, including greater social interest on 3 of the 4 items. However, there were no effects of training on implicit biases. All groups associated autism with unpleasant attributes, including the group that received the autism acceptance training. Interestingly, we also found that the implicit and explicit measures didn't correlate with one another, which suggests that there were different processes at work here, and that the training really was only effective on one. So why might this be happening? Well, Explicit biases are conscious, they're controlled. What this tells us is that one thing the training might be doing is affecting social desirability. It could just be affecting what the person believes is socially appropriate way to think and behave in relation to autism, and they're checking themselves when asked about these things later. Implicit biases, in contrast, are more automatic, they're ingrained. They may be much more resistant to change. It's one reason that brief implicit bias trainings that many institutions require don't actually tend to change implicit biases. What seems more important for changing implicit biases is long-term context, and the quantity of that context matters. Short-term training just doesn't seem to likely be sufficient for affecting changes on implicit biases. Now, none of the studies I just mentioned actually measured real-world social interaction. Our previous studies did at least use videos of actual autistic people, which were an improvement on prior type of studies. But these studies are still artificial to some degree and may not reflect what actually happens when two unfamiliar people meet each other. So one of my former doctoral students, Carrie Ann Morrison, took these prior studies into the real world for her dissertation project. She found that following a real-world get-to-know-you conversation between two unfamiliar conversation partners, autistic adults were, again, rated as more awkward and less socially warm by both non-autistic and autistic partners. And as we saw in our prior studies, non-autistic adults expressed greater social interest in non-autistic relative to autistic partners. But interestingly enough, our autistic participants didn't share this bias and actually trended towards greater social interest in autistic relative to non-autistic partners. They also reported disclosing more about themselves to autistic compared to non-autistic people, suggesting they were interacting more freely and differently with autistic relative to non-autistic partners. I should mention that we did not disclose diagnoses here. In a few cases, they came up naturally and organically in the conversations, but that was left up to participants to discuss. So to circle back to earlier in the talk, we think that these findings help show that social disability in autism is relational, not individual. If social impairment was intrinsic to autism, interaction would be even worse among two interacting autistic partners. Shouldn't the interaction be doubly bad if two people, each with social impairments, are conversing with one another? But that's not what we find. And in fact, in many ways, we find the exact opposite. The interaction is actually enhanced. Now, we're not the only group studying this concept. Many other groups are doing phenomenal work in this area. I mentioned Catherine Crompton earlier, and she recently published a series of elegant papers showing that communication between autistic people is just as efficient as between non-autistic people. It's when autistic and non-autistic people are interacting that communication seems to break down. She also finds, as I mentioned before, that autistic people report having greater rapport with other autistic people relative to non-autistic people. There are other groups like Dimitris Bolis and Brett Heisman and several others that are finding related things. In other words, we're starting to see a growing empirical base supporting the concept of the double empathy problem and how it might contribute to social disability in autism. So let me end by just talking about what my lab is doing now and where we're planning to go. Right now, we're examining whether and how autistic people interact differently with autistic relative to non-autistic partners. What leads to greater rapport when it happens? We're also examining how non-autistic people interact differently with autistic people than with non-autistic people. We're examining where the disjunction occurs when it does to get a better grasp on what's driving relational social impairments between autistic and non-autistic people. We're also examining whether certain traits in social partners are evaluated and valued differently by autistic and non-autistic raters. Recall that we found that autistic raters were just as likely as non-autistic ones to label autistic people as awkward, but that didn't lead, in their case, to less social interest in them. Perhaps awkward means something different to different groups of people. As Damian Milton once told me, I actually look for awkwardness in people. I know that those are my people, and I know that I will get along better with them. Kylie, in her dissertation, is examining how non-autistic perceptions of autistic people differ across social contexts and social demands, like job interviews and dating scenarios, to get more information about how and why impression formation could affect these different outcomes in different contexts. She's also examining whether poor first impressions lead non-autistic people to underestimate the abilities and competencies of autistic people. So we can objectively measure their cognitive and social cognitive abilities, for instance, and have non-autistic people try to predict them based on their observations of them. And we're predicting that they're going to be less accurate doing so. More long-term, we're interested in whether and how non-autistic perceptions relate to things like internalized stigma among autistic people and mental health for autistic people. And ultimately, the big overarching question here is the double empathy problem solvable? One way I'm hoping to do this is to conduct longitudinal dyadic interaction studies to see how interaction and communication changes with familiarity between autistic and non-autistic people. Does double empathy increase with meaningful long-term relationship building? I think that would give us a lot of insight into the factors that may help broaden and put a bridge between the disconnect we see between autistic and non-autistic communication. So I'm just going to end here with acknowledgements of my funding sources, and then primarily my doctoral students, who are always the driving engine behind the work that we do. Kylie, Daniel Faso, Daniel Hubbard, Desi Jones, and Carrie Ann Morrison. And then a lot of my colleagues here in the United States and across the world who contributed to the work I presented today. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noah. That was absolutely fantastic talk. I'm sure there's lots of interest from people watching as well. And thank you for giving such a comprehensive overview of your research journey and from how your research has evolved over recent years and how we're moving in our conceptualization of some of these issues as well. It was really, really interesting. If anybody has any questions for Noah, please feel free to type them in the question and answer. There's been a few questions there already. We just pick up on one of those. I'll ask you one, then Mary can ask you one of the others. There's a question about the role of diversity of ethnicity within autism studies and whether that has an important additional place to role to play, especially alongside thinking about those dyads that are interacting and sort of the differences within that dyad.
Yeah, that's an incredibly important question. Now, unfortunately, because this was our first attempt at this kind of dyadic research, which is incredibly kind of complex logistically, trying to schedule two people at the same time who are unfamiliar with each other, and the multitude of factors that affect social interaction and perception. And because we were trying to isolate this the singular factor of autism versus non-autism kind of status, we try to control for other things. Now, that's an incredibly large limitation, because what we ended up making the hard choice to do is to limit our study to males in the study because of the potentially confounding effects of social interaction in mixed gender dyads. Obviously, I would like to expand this work in many directions. There are so many factors, interpersonal factors, that affect impression formation and interaction quality. Race is highly salient for people, obviously. Gender is highly salient. Age, there are many obvious factors. And even though this was a real world study in the sense that we're having actual people interact with each other, it's still highly controlled in an experimental setting, so we can try to isolate effects of the variable of interest in that stuff. Now, I think a big problem in autism research, which thankfully is getting more attention recently, my doctoral student Desi Jones has helped to highlight this issue, is that the samples that are overwhelmingly studied in autism research are a very small subset of autistic people in the world. They tend, as I mentioned earlier, to be disproportionately male, disproportionately white, disproportionately from high social status, educational status background. That, I think, in large degree, is because of the access researchers tend to have through their institutional settings, but also it's a reflection of the lack of diversity in autism research itself. With increased diversity among autism researchers, I think that is going to help lead the charge to increase diversity among autistic samples, which ultimately, long-term, hopefully, can lead to systemic changes in terms of the disparities we also see at the clinical level, and how who receives treatment and how they receive treatment, and diagnostic indicators and other things like that. I mean, that's an enormous problem, I think, in autism research, and the commenter is important, is very astute for noting that. And I confess that it's a problem in my research too. The recruitment source that we have tends to be more affluent and tends to be more white.
You're on mute, Debbie.
Yeah.
Sorry, I realized just as I started talking. There's a question that links nicely to that and actually provides a good follow-on question. You're talking about the researchers who are doing the work, etc. And there's a question here about how much has changed, given how much has changed in autism research over the recent years, how do you feel your role has changed as a researcher? And in relation to that, do you think psychology has the tools, concepts, ideas to properly answer these sorts of questions?
Those are great questions. I don't think psychology alone has the tools to answer these questions. I think psychology needs to work within a broader kind of social framework, and it is very important for psychologists working in this area to not just study the autism research literature or the psychology literature, but to study broader sociology, to study broader history, to understand all the intersecting dynamics. This is an interdisciplinary world that we are working towards for the better. And I think my own journey has reflected that, in large part because I started being more connected to the scholarship from the autism community themselves, and working towards an effort to have more kind of a participatory model of autistic students and collaborators on my work. Those perspectives have foundationally changed how the kind of work that I do, the assumptions that I make, that I think continue in many autism research labs. There are sadly many autism researchers who have very limited interaction with autistic people. I think it's very important to have your work evaluated from an autistic perspective. That can lead you to see things that you didn't see. There are many blind spots in autism research, because for a long time, autism research was meant for other autism researchers. And when that happens, it's very good for people's scientific careers, but it doesn't always filter down to having a translational benefit, and it doesn't always reflect what autistic people themselves would like to be researched. So things are changing. I think things are picking up momentum as autistic people's perspectives are hopefully being incorporated into autism research more, and autistic researchers themselves are becoming more prominent within autism research, which I think is desperately needed. There are many great autism researchers, not just in psychology, but in other disciplines as well. The question of, does psychology have the tools? I mentioned some of the limitations of the kind of approaches we do, which is trying to isolate cause and effect relationships or looking at associative relationships. And the way we do that experimentally is by eliminating confounds. But confounds is what the nature of the world is. The world has many intersecting variables happening at once, and isolating them to look at relationships between just a series of variables may not reflect how they actually work in the context of all the variables at play. That's a limitation of my own work, but I still believe that empirical research has a huge role to play in trying to more objectively understand the dynamics at play here. We just have to be very sensitive and careful about what we consider to be objective and to make sure that we are conducting studies objectively.
No, we've had a flurry of really excellent questions in the Q&A, and I'm really sorry that because of the time we won't get through all of them. And we've had lots of interesting questions around the role of mental health, about depression and anxiety in social cognition and extending your framework to thinking about intrinsic and extrinsic factors and looking at beyond neurodevelopmental conditions and looking at, for example, schizophrenia. But one question I would like to finish up on, because I thought was really interesting, was around understanding double empathy further, and whether there might be something really interesting in looking at sibling relationships as natural longitudinal dyads with which to understand double empathy, or potentially about enhancing double empathy further.
That's a wonderful idea. Our initial autism acceptance training was focusing on these few findings we found earlier, that autistic people tended to be evaluated more favorably by those who had more autism knowledge and who had more autism familiarity. Now we're seeing that tends to relate to these explicit, not these implicit biases. But one hope for mitigating implicit biases is to try to prevent the formation of those strong associations early. If indeed it's the case that younger children, for instance, don't demonstrate those implicit biases to the same degree, it would suggest to us that those develop over time through reinforcement of autism-related concepts out there culturally that are being encoded. There's a lot of autism portrayals now in fictional accounts, some better than others. Some are very heavily imbued with stereotypes. So if we see, for instance, less of those implicit biases at a younger age, it may suggest that we have the potential through inclusion, through acceptance, through interaction with autistic people from a young age, that those concepts don't form to the same degree. Now, I would think that those concepts may extend obviously to the family members who have a lot of extensive interaction, like siblings. That is an interaction with one specific person. Perhaps that non-autistic sibling also then will have more interaction with autistic people broadly, but that might not be the case for many. But if indeed familiarity with people's different communication styles and differences in their expectations leads to greater understanding of those differences, we may see differences in concepts of double empathy there. We don't always see that. Brett Huesman has a really interesting paper showing that parents of autistic children report differences in understanding what the autistic person is feeling compared to what they are reporting themselves. So that might not always be the case, but if we're going to test this idea that connection is driven through familiarity, and we do see that in other kind of literatures, right? If you want to break down kind of racial biases, for instance, it helps to have long-term meaningful relationship formation with people from that stereotyped group that debunk those stereotypes. And over time, it's those meaningful relationships that lead to a reduction in those biases. Thankfully, I think autistic people are fighting for and experiencing more kind of cultural inclusion and are being included in broader society more broadly. So over time, maybe we're going to see a benefit of these things. I did reference earlier that we see much stronger stigmatized effects for things like schizophrenia. I don't think we've seen the kind of cultural change around schizophrenia that we have around autism, and the misinformation and misconceptualizations of schizophrenia can be even more damaging, because we see in our studies, for instance, that it's associated with people's perceptions of danger, for instance, more so than autistic people. And that is really hard implicit bias to fight against. So whoever mentioned doing these studies with people with schizophrenia, I think that's going to be incredibly important too. Schizophrenia is often associated with more social exclusion and more isolation because of the nature of the condition itself, but also because of these cultural extrinsic factors.
Great.
You just answered the next. You answered the next.
Okay.
I was going to read out to you. So I'll follow up the question that there is about mental health conditions in schizophrenia. The question also is, do you think we should use quite distinct frameworks for our research on mental illnesses versus neurodevelopmental diversity, or can we learn from across these frameworks?
So say that question again.
So do you think we need distinct frameworks for research on mental illness versus neurodevelopmental diversity?
I think it's really important to try to understand the specific mechanisms leading to bad outcomes for the specific people that we are studying. You know, in our work, for instance, when we're working with autistic adults without intellectual disability, the factors that are leading to their poor outcomes may skew more heavily to these extrinsic mechanisms. For certain people with certain mental health conditions, that may not be the case, right? So for somebody who is actively psychotic, for instance, there is a primary need to control aspects of that psychosis before some of these extrinsic mechanisms become as important. So depending on the nature of what is driving the disability the person is experiencing should lead to how you approach improving that person's circumstances, right? I think in autism, we are increasingly seeing, at least from my perspective, that the focus on intrinsic mechanisms being the driving force of disability among autistic adults without intellectual disability, those assumptions are not always being borne out in the ways that I think have long informed autism research and treatment. Now, that might be different for different subpopulations within autism, and definitely for people with different conditions. I think it's just really important to try to be objective as possible in trying to understand what does that person from their own subjective perspective need to improve their circumstances. What people outside of autism often presume autistic people need is not what the autistic person themselves believe that they need. And we should listen to them. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a perfect point to finish on as well, I think. There are many more questions, but I have copied and pasted them into a Word document, which I will forward to you, Noah, afterwards, so that you've got a copy of all the questions from today, including those that we haven't managed to get through. But it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to Noah for such a fantastic presentation, a really comprehensive story of research in the area. It's really great to see how the research is involved and how you've evolved your perspectives and taken those new perspectives in your research. So thank you very much for that talk. It's great to see such fabulous data in a talk as well. And thank you to everybody who has attended the webinar today from wherever you are in the world. It's great to have such a wide international audience as well. So thank you very much, Noah, for giving us your time today. And thank you to everybody who has attended the departmental seminar today.